Emily Dickinson, one of the greatest American poets of the 19th century. Her work, most of which was never published in her life, is often framed in terms of its skepticism. Her doubts in the existence of God and in the Christian Church are among the most common refrains in her work, along with skepticism toward the established social norms expected of a well-to-do woman in Amherst, Massachusetts. Historically, critics have treated these poems as puzzle boxes, which open to reveal their meaning only after solving a cipher, identifying a certain system of symbols with a superimposed meaning, often aided by research into Dickinson's personal life. And while there is good reason to look at the broader thematics of Dickinson's body of works, it is worth examining more closely the mechanics of this skepticism to see how pervasive it truly is. Scholar Mei-Shu Chen writes that Dickinson's driving principle in addressing religion is a skepticism of the traditionally defined beliefs, especially intricate and indefinable concepts. Conformity to dull-received definitions, interpretations, and usage was unacceptable. Although Chen is addressing Dickinson's stance toward Christianity in particular, if we extrapolate a broader poetics from this same concept, then we can begin to see a very basic kind of linguistic skepticism emerge. Why are certain cultural meanings imposed on certain arbitrary words? It's clear from Dickinson's poetry that her words are chosen very carefully in order to make readers question what they are doing on the page, and with enough care, it becomes impossible to ignore that grammatological rules and traditions of the English language quickly come into question. Words, phrases, and linguistic functions are often elusive, a product of Dickinson's elliptically compressed, disjunctive, and at times ungrammatical linguistic style, which relies on metaphors so densely compacted that literal components of meaning fade. Perhaps the most notable and anachronistic linguistic rebellion in Dickinson's poetry is her heavy use of parataxis, which creates a style of narration akin to a stream of consciousness that ignores standard syntactical subordination. More importantly, however, is Dickinson's attention to language as a construct, and her tendency to redirect readers to examine the abstract semiotic systems which comprise language through ambivalent or ambiguous linguistic devices. To this end, Dickinson manipulates grammatical aspects which are relevant with regard to a text's meaning, the conscious interpretation of which requires reflection of how language works. With such a linguistic focus in Dickinson's poetry, we might be inclined to read poems such as I Dwell in Possibility with a more critical eye. If we are to read this, as others, with an underlying subject of language, perhaps we might see the possibility referred to by the speaker as a sort of interpretive possibility. This house of possibility is impregnable because intrinsic meaning cannot be deduced in a formulaic manner. Finally, our speaker spreads her narrow hands wide, as if to make multiplicitous which once seemed singular. Each phrase, line, or word opens wide when examined with underlying linguistic concerns in mind. Even here we may see how linear meaning collapses when the unstable nature of language is considered. Take gambrels, for instance. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, this word may refer to a kind of sloped roof once common in New England. Alternatively, its first definition indicates a meat hook used by butchers to suspend carcasses. Suddenly, with this reading, the poem becomes morbid, and those fair visitors might be imagined coming to their horrific doom. Whatever paradise the speaker finds in their demise is left to one's grim imagination. What's certain is that with such an interpretive heel turn, dependent on the reading of a single word, linguistic possibility, without a doubt, is everywhere. More often than not, Dickinson's poems express much more than merely semantic fluidity, but reject readers' attempts at meaning-making altogether through their convoluted exercise of grammar. Crisis is a hare is emblematic of Dickinson's paratactic style, completely unpunctuated and lacking connective tissue to string together its dependent clauses, leaving the text widely open to subjective grammatical assumptions. The first 3 lines of the first stanza of this poem seem to subordinate themselves in a relatively obvious way, toward which and past which both appear to indicate the spatial relation of the forces to the crisis. However, line 4 complicates our understanding of this relationship. It presumably refers to crisis, but there are 2 equally plausible grammatical readings. That crisis is likened to a hare only if crisis comes in sleep, or these forces react to a crisis only if it comes in sleep. To illustrate these 2 interpretive possibilities, we may rewrite our alternate readings with standard subordination and clearer punctuation, purely for our own comprehension, of course. Either option has the potential to obliterate the conceits at the heart of this poem. Option 1 is the more disruptive, threatening the metaphor that begins the poem. Crisis is a hare. Option 2, on the other hand, destabilizes the relationship between the crisis and the forces, making it dependent on the same arbitrary frame of reference. All the while, we are unsure if the crisis really has come in sleep or not, with everything discussed thus far hinging on the key word, if. And this is no small matter. Dickinson's insistence in this mangled metaphor is that observers hold ultimate epistemic authority. If one sleeps or wakes, then the referential meaning symbolized by a hare or by a crisis is substantively altered. In just its first 4 lines, Dickinson has placed this poem in a linguistic superposition where undecidability is the only constant. Too few conclusions can be made in Dickinson's poetry to arrive at a comprehensive sense of her poetics. The poetry itself shies away from essentializing narratives, or narrative continuity altogether. With this in mind, it might be most accurate to simply say that Dickinson distrusts her medium and wants us to know it. The effect of many of her poems is primarily to make the instability of language known, and strip the illusion of authority from language as a result. Words are left as husks devoid of meaning, pointing not to a discrete sign, as we may like to think, but to everything at once, or nothing at all. Scholar Aziz Yusuf al-Mutalibi sees a central theme of linguistic flux, saying of Dickinson's poetry, the textual meanings are elusive, that they are never present, and that they are recognizably deferred. The signifiers, the words in these poems, are in a constant change. When analyzing a Dickinson poem, we would be wise to speak not of the meaning, but a meaning out of many. For once we find something in the language, it begins to slip from our fingers and change shape altogether.